All right, this is the Cortez City Council work session / special meeting. Today is Tuesday, May 14th, 2024, and the time is 5:34 p.m. I'd like to call this meeting to order and start with A on our agenda, council role training presented by Sam Light, General Counsel for CIRSA. Thank you for joining us, Sam.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Council. On the microphone?
Yeah, make sure it turns green. There you go.
There we go. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Council, so much for having me out. Thank you, staff, as well, for inviting me down. It's wonderful to come down this way and visit with you all, and thank you all as well, appointed officials who've also joined us this evening. So, my name's Sam Light, and I am Deputy Executive Director and General Counsel for the new members of Council, or those who are not familiar with what CIRSA stands for. CIRSA is an acronym for the Colorado Intergovernmental Risk Sharing Agency, which is kind of whew, right? So that's why we use the acronym. And we are the city's insurance provider for property and casualty coverage. We provide your insurance coverage for things like your buildings and your vehicles. We also provide liability coverage for everything from a slip and fall on a sidewalk to a public official's liability claim. So one of the things that we do on behalf of our members at CIRSA is we provide training for elected and appointed officials this evening, and so thank you for the invitation to come down and visit you all this evening. I know that we do have a couple of new council members, and I know a couple of you have also attended my trainings in the past, but whether you're brand new or got a couple of years under your belt, I hope you find the training helpful, either as a refresher or as an orientation to some of the concepts around risk management that govern municipal entities. And also, if you're an appointed official, though, a number of my comments are directed towards the City Council. I think you'll find that a lot of my comments relate to appointed governing bodies as well, whether you're on the Planning Commission or another group. Most of the concepts that I talk about this evening still apply to appointed local public bodies. Okay? A little bit more about CIRSA before I dive into my training suggestions or my risk management suggestions. CIRSA is not a commercial insurance company. We're what's called a public entity self-insurance pool. We were formed back in 1982. Our only members, our only insureds, our only book of business is Colorado cities and towns and affiliated entities like housing authorities or renewal authorities and so on. We insure about 90% of the municipalities in Colorado. That's almost all of the small ones, almost all of the small to mid-size, and almost all of the mid-size to large. We do not include as members of our pools the big ones like the Denvers and the Colorado Springs, because frankly they would be too large for pooling. It would kind of be a wag the dog type of situation. We have about 290 members right now, and again, that's about 90% of the municipalities around the state. You can learn more about CIRSA at www.cirsa.org. And you can also find more information about us in one of the handouts. I've got a couple of handouts that I put at your places at the dais, and I'll mention them as we go through the materials. But the first one is CIRSA at a glance. It just gives you a little bit more of a snapshot about CIRSA and what we do. One of the other things in being a public entity self-insurance pool is we are very proud of the fact that it allows us to establish long-term partnerships with our members around risk management. To give you a sense of that partnership, you at the City of Cortez have been a member of our property and casualty pool since 1995. So thank you for that. Thank you for the long-standing partnership that we have. We value and appreciate your membership in CIRSA. If there's ever any suggestions that you have for us or things that you think your insurer might be able to assist you as an entity with, we're always eager to hear from our members with thoughts, concerns, criticisms, suggestions. So please feel free to reach out through your manager if you have any thoughts for us. Okay. I'm going to talk about, I've organized my presentation around what I call suggestions related to risk management. They're really suggestions for best practices on how we conduct our business as individual elected and appointed officials, as local public bodies. And I hope that these suggestions will help you, enhance your effectiveness individually as an elected official, but as important, if not more important, as a body, as the council, as the institution of council. Being a member of a member governing body at the end of the day is a we job, right? Each of us brings to that job our own experiences, our own perspectives. When you're having deliberations, when you're debating whether or not to adopt some policy or ordinance, yes, 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 bring your own viewpoints, perspectives to the table. Deliberate with many voices, but at the end of the day, council acts with one voice, whether that's by unanimity or a split vote. So among the suggestions that I'm going to talk about is the role of being a public official. We'll talk about organizational structure and liability, touch on transparency, open meetings. For the new members, is this your first tenure in public elected office, public office? Okay, so we'll talk about how, and we know this intuitively, but the expectations around transparency in public life and for public organizations are much different than the private sector. That sort of kind of explains why you hear most of the news you hear about in the local news has to do with public entities, because so much more information is readily available, right? Then we'll talk about the code of ethics. When you took office, whether you're elected or appointed, you became subject to Colorado's code of ethics. Talk a little bit about what that means, and then we'll talk some about due process and the requirements around honoring people's due process rights. I do want to make our time together as helpful to you all as possible, and I know you have a meeting after this. The slides are available from staff along with the handout, so if we get sidetracked with a question, that's just fine with me. Please feel free to interrupt with a question. But please recognize also, kind of a disclaimer here, that though I am an attorney, this is not an attorney-client discussion, right? This is a training. These are best practices. So again, you can ask me any question you like. I'm happy to take those and give you a CIRSA's risk management thoughts. But if my radar is going off, telling me that your question relates to the live burning question of the day here in Cortez, right? You know how that goes. Sometimes someone will say, yes, Sam, I've got a question. What if another member of the council does this? And everyone's eyes open wide, and this is going to be exciting, right? My radar is telling me that if that's a legal question, that's for Patrick and your city attorney team to help you with that. Same thing if it's a matter that's in the manager's wheelhouse. I may still have thoughts on either of those from a risk management perspective, from CIRSA's perspective, but you do want to rely upon and use your direct reports, your manager, your attorney as a resource and as a support for those kinds of questions, which is a segue into one of my most important risk management suggestions, and that is use your direct reports, your manager, your attorney, as a resource for you as counsel, right, to help get things done as an organization and to help you all look good while doing it, right? We're going to talk a little bit later how everyone, yes, has their own kind of role within the organization. It's not that we're silos, but we're all working together. So you want to use your manager effectively as a resource. That also helps protect you from risk that we'll talk about a little bit more, okay? As I mentioned, I organized my presentation around what I call suggestions for success. And the first one may not sound like much of a risk management suggestion, but it really is, right? And that is commit to the role of being a public official. Do we all agree with this notion that when you were elected or appointed, right, your role and relationship to the community changes pretty dramatically, right? You're no longer just a citizen of Cortez, right? You're now an elected or appointed official, and from a certain perspective, that's a 24/7 job. Please have a personal life and please enjoy it, right? If you can, if there's time permits. But, recognize that from the perspective of your citizens, the people you take counsel from, right, the circles you travel in, they will always perceive you to be an elected or appointed official. So council members, do you sometimes interact with citizens? Sure you do, right? And that's not necessarily just at these meetings, right? In your ambassador role on behalf of the organization, you may bump into a citizen everywhere, anywhere, and they may say something to you like, the council member, when's the council going to do something about this? And maybe your own radar is going off and you're thinking, well, I'm not sure because we as a council haven't talked about that issue yet. But the citizen persists and says, well, I know that, but what's your personal opinion? And you think, okay, I'll bite. And you tell them, this is my personal opinion. This is my personal opinion. This is my personal opinion. what are they filtering? Council member, council member, council member, at all times, right? And as they should, of course, our words, our deeds, our conduct matters as elected and appointed officials, has an impact, leaves an impression. When you're making decisions that affect people's property or their livelihoods, their businesses, definitely has an impact on their legal rights, right? And sometimes if you have one of those interactions with a citizen, fair or unfair, if it doesn't go down the way they thought it should, that might even leave a residue. And in a real bad situation, it can create potential liability risks where someone thinks you said something that, with this apparent authority that you have, that somehow caused them to change their position. And next thing we hear is, based on these comments from this or that council member, I went ahead and did this or that, and I thought that was okay. So you do want to have your radar on in those interactions, and you do want to make sure you recognize that that perception is always out there, okay? Recognize also that you're no longer an outsider to local government, right? Now that you're on the council or you're on an appointed body, you're now part of the ultimate insiders, and it has a risk management attachment in this sense. On the inside, right, we have those hundreds of pages of ordinances and rules and policies and codes that apply, right, to how we do business, both substantively and procedurally. And on the inside, those rules stick to us. You ever bump across somebody who has, decided intentionally that they're going to stay on the outside because they feel like they can be more effective and affect more change in local government if they stay on the outside? And sometimes those people choose that because why? Well, some of the things that stick to you don't stick to them, like the open meetings law, right? Or decision-making standards, right? Or other obligations like that. So we're bound to follow the rules that apply. It doesn't mean that as the legislative body, right, you can't change those rules, but if you're going to change rules, you want to make sure you're doing it within the proper and under the proper procedures, okay? And then finally recognize, right, that the role of public official, elected public official in particular, you're a representative of the organization, you're an ambassador. In legal terms, in risk terms, you're a fiduciary, right? We all know what that concept means. That's the legal obligation to put the interest of the organization that we serve as a fiduciary, the city, above all other interests, above personal interests, right? Above the interests of sometimes of the small but vocal minority, right? The fiduciary obligation requires that we take a broad and long view of the interests of the city. Do you agree with the notion that sometimes that ain't easy? Right? Sometimes you might have on the agenda a controversial issue, a difficult decision, emotions are running high, there's a lot of people here to make public comment. And the first person who stands up during public comment says, "Council, do this, and you've got to do it tonight." And the next person who stands up says, "Council, don't do that, do exactly the opposite." All right, so now we're again remembering I don't get to make 100% of the people happy 100% of the time in this job. But in terms of serving that fiduciary interest, one of the things that we suggest in our training, and it's really a power and prerogative that you have as the council. That is, if you're in that kind of situation, take the time that you need and get the information that you think you need to help you make decisions in view of that fiduciary interest. Sometimes the claims that we handle on your behalf at CIRSA, not yours in particular, but our members' behalf at CIRSA, sometimes have a little foundation where it feels like the decision was one made in haste, right? So if you're ever feeling that, if something comes up and you're thinking, well, we haven't had enough of an opportunity to deliberate as a council at a meeting about this issue, so let's hold this over a little bit. Or we feel like something's come up during the hearing and we need to ask our manager, do we have resources on this issue? Or maybe someone's cajoling you to say, "Council, get involved and do this," and you're not even sure you have legal authority. Well, then that's for Patrick and his team to help you understand whether you have authority to get involved in those kinds of things. So take that time to get the information you need, right? And take the time that you need to make good decisions and have good deliberations around issues. Particularly true for elected and appointed officials, but true for everyone in a public organization like ours here, right? But one of the job descriptions for elected and appointed officials is to deliver good governance, right? Which I think at root really depends upon committing to some core civics principles. And if you commit to those, I think the related legal issues take care of themselves, right? And I've got a couple of them here noted on the slide, but before I dig into those just a little bit, let me ask this question. I was going to ask it just to the new folks, but I know you're real new to the job, so I'll ask everybody, do you like process? Do you like process? Yes. Yeah, at the local, sometimes in local government we kind of get a bad rap in that regard. Oh, it takes so long, it's so bureaucratic, right? But at the local government level, process is intentional. And it's in view of making consistent, predictable decisions, right? It's in view of serving that fiduciary interest. So you want to learn to embrace product as a process in and of itself. Embrace process irrespective of outcome, right? And that'll serve you very well. Make sure that in that process, even if you were disappointed with the outcome, you were on the, 3 side of a 4-3 vote or something like that, you want your citizens to walk away from your meetings with the idea that that was a good process. Citizen may walk away thinking, well, I disagree with what the council or the planning commission decided, but you know what? I feel like it was a good process. I feel like I was heard. I feel like it was a very straightforward hearing process, and I feel like I was respected. That's a, faith and trust in you all individually, and as the council goes up and risk goes down, okay? Commit always in that process to consider issues on their merits alone. As a fiduciary, fascinating thing about being in local government is, you may, when you decide to run for council or get involved in a board or commission, you may have thought, well, I've got this one issue that's important. But your responsibility for good process is a broader array of issues, right? You want to be a good representative for the city on behalf of all issues that come in front of you of council, even if it's not the one that you like the most. You know how it is. Some of us like the water plan, some of us like the tax issues, some of us are really excited about master planning, but whatever it is, the 7 of us are all called to embrace all of the issues that come in front of council, okay? So in terms of those civics principles, really, commit to openness and transparency, and you'll have few, if any, disputes, lawsuits, concerns over compliance with the open meetings law or the open records law. Commit to fundamental fairness, and you'll have few applicants, whoever step forward and say you're violating my due process rights. At the council level and at the planning commission level, that probably doesn't present itself all that often, but if it does, from CIRSA standpoint, what we want you to do is just make sure you slow the process down. If an applicant or someone during public comment stands up and says, I make a procedural objection to your going forward with this hearing, what we want you to do at CIRSA is slow it down and handle that concern on the record. Somebody says, do we have proper notice? Somebody stands up, public comment, I object to your proceeding with this hearing because I didn't get notice. Which I always thought was kind of strange because they're standing right there, right? So they must have found out somehow, right? But there's issues that have more hair and warts on them, right? And if those come up, then you want to slow it down, talk with your staff, make sure we make a record of how that procedural concern is handled. From a risk management perspective, very important for us at CIRSA because the record you make during your public hearings is the one and only record that will be used for defense if there's ever a legal proceeding around that decision that's reached in a public hearing. Our fortunes rise and fall on the quality, right, and integrity of your record. So we want to make a good record in that regard. Commit to being predictable and even-handed. Hopefully for the new folks, they don't do this anymore, but back when I was a municipal attorney, once you took the oath of office, it was like almost immediately the clerk would hand you the 100-page, book of several hundred pages of ordinances. They're still there, they're just online, right? And so we have to commit to apply those rules predictably and even-handedly. We don't want to be in situations where, you have multiple types of requests coming to council, and most of them are just happen matter of course, and it's fine. But then there's an applicant who steps forward and says, well, that's kind of strange because for my application, that's the one where I feel like they were asking some things that weren't required. And I feel like there were some strange discussions going on at the hearing, but most concerningly, that was the night, that the council or the commission, for the first time, took some novel and unprecedented interpretation of its own decision-making standards and turn me down, or approve me, whatever it may be, right? Risk runs both directions on those kinds of issues. So you want to be committed to being predictable and even-handed, okay? Unless there are any questions on that, I thought I'd pivot now and talk about organizational structure. All right, every municipal corporation, everyone in that organization has a job description, right? The city council, to use a private sector analogy, you're kind of the board of directors, right? But irrespective of whether you're elected, appointed, a full-time employee like staff, or a volunteer, everyone has a job description. And it's important people honor and respect and stay within their job description, stay within their authority, and as important, stay away from authority that they don't have, right? To protect the organization and themselves from risk. So for the new folks in particular, but a refresher for everyone, I want to talk about what your protections are, because that's an important question, but I hope it wasn't your first question to Patrick. But it's a natural question if you asked him, can I get sued in this job as an elected official or an appointed official? And the answer is, sure, right? But we have good protection in Colorado. First, let me tell you what those are and then what the limitations are. Under the Colorado Governmental Immunity Act, the city, and by extension the city's insurance company, CIRSA, will defend you and will pay judgments entered against you for acts or omissions as an elected or appointed official. That's the public official's liability coverage. That's the obligation of the city under state law. Now, like so many things in life, there's a bit of a catch to that, right? Those protections apply only so long as we're acting within the scope of our employment and not acting in a willful and wanton manner. Scope of employment sounds a little odd to an elected or appointed official because you might be thinking, well, scope of employment, I'm not a full-time staff member. I'm not like the manager, attorney, or the clerk. So that doesn't apply to me, right? Wrong, right? Scope of employment is simply the phrase that's used in the immunity statute, okay? And what it really means is just staying within one's authority that they have under law, staying within one's job description. So just to illustrate that point, a real simple example, but using your own codes, right? Within whose job description here in Cortez, within whose job description, within whose scope of employment, right? Is it to determine whether or not an individual or a business gets a business license? Under your code, the city clerk executes the form and the finance director is responsible for oversight. Staff's going to jump in and tell me if I've got that wrong, right? So, with that authority assigned to those folks, within whose scope of employment ain't it? Well, not only you, but everybody else, right? Same thing for building permits, right? By your own ordinances, right? Who's within whose scope of employment is it to decide whether or not someone is not in compliance with the building code and therefore has their building project red tagged? Only the building official, not the elected officials or the appointed officials. This idea runs all directions. Within whose scope of employment, within whose job description is it to decide whether or not this corporation buys or sells real estate? How about the council? Whether or not this corporation takes on debt? You or the citizens, if they were so inclined, right? Who decides whether or not, within whose scope of employment, decide whether or not we adopt a quality of life ordinance, whether it be like regulations for food trucks or short-term rentals or backyard roosters? No, you can't have roosters, hens, right? Do you allow those at all? Hens. Roosters aren't allowed? I don't think. Yeah, that's the council's job. So irrespective of how much staff is recommending or advising against that, it's within your scope of employment to make those kinds of determinations, okay? So that's that piece. Willful and wanton, just be attuned to that. Willful and wanton is simply a fancy legal phrase for this. It's conduct that's intentionally undertaken, designed to injure someone's legal rights, and taken with reckless disregard for what their rights are. And I've got an even simpler way of describing it. I just call it bad stuff, okay? If you are found to have engaged in willful and wanton conduct, right, that's where the protections fall away, and there's no obligation of the city or the insurer to protect you from that liability. It's a short and long-handed way of saying you're on your own, right? And you can be personally liable for that. Now, that's a pretty high burden for a claimant, and we don't, knock on wood, get too many claims around that sort of allegation, but we do at CIRSA every now and then, and every year we get a couple of those claims where someone's seeking to impose individual and personal liability on an elected or appointed official employee for willful and wanton conduct. My claims people tell me that this is almost always the situation and where that risk arises. It's almost always an individual elected or appointed official acting individually and misperceiving that they have some governmental authority that they actually don't have, right? Throwing on that purported cloak of governmental authority and doing bad things to people for the wrong reason. And it really would be bad stuff. Now, in my building official example, it might be throwing on that purported cloak and conscripting a staff member who's also not thinking of the issue clearly and going on a campaign to make sure my business competitor gets their building project red tagged. Not a good idea, right? Or intentionally defaming someone wearing a cloak of governmental authority. So those risks are few and far between. You intuitively know what bad stuff is. You're going to stay far away from it. But I needed to mention that because it does impact your protections, sets the outer limits of those protections, both in terms of the city's obligation to protect and indemnify you and the insurance company's obligation as well. Because like all public officials' liability coverage, your CIRSA coverage includes exceptions where we do not cover the civil liability that flows from willful and wanton conduct, criminal acts, malicious acts, that kind of thing, okay? All right. This whole idea of discussing job description or scope of employment probably in your mind begs the question, right? What is the city structure? What's my job description as elected official or appointed official, right? So just a couple of real high-level thoughts around that issue. The city is a home rule city, right? Do the new members know that distinction between home rule and statutory? If you're a statutory city, you can only do what the state legislature, bless them, tells you can do, right? If you're home rule, you got a little more power in matters of local concern, okay? Under your form of government, you've elected a council manager form of government, which is the gold standard and is the most common form of municipal organization, particularly for home rule municipalities. Under that structure, there really is an allocation of responsibility between the governing body, and analogize that to a corporate board of directors. We just don't call it the board of directors, we call it the city council, right? And its CEO, which we don't call CEO, we call the city manager, right? That's the most common form of municipal structure. Quoting from your own charter, the city council is the legislative, policymaking, the legislative and governing body of the city. That means you're responsible for legislation, policy, and governance of the organization at the highest directorship level, right? The mayor is the presiding officer. You get assigned things and go to ceremonies, and so the city gets to take even more of your time. But you all can go to events too, right? The city manager, as your charter describes it, is your chief executive officer and head of the administrative branch, responsible for overseeing the day-to-day operations, right? So that's that allocation of authority, and you want to use that to your advantage, right? In terms of a hierarchy of how you might look at this, right? You want to ask yourself, where does the city council focus its efforts? And on the left-hand side of the slide, you're in the top two areas there. Who owns our corporation, right? The citizens, right? So part of your scope of employment is to provide a process, right? You do, this room, for people to come and talk to you about needs and wants of the community, and you're uniquely positioned in the org chart to help determine how we put governmental resources on those needs and wants, right? Sometimes you have to end up deciding, no, we don't have the resources, or no, we don't have the authority, but you get to have those discussions around empowering and resourcing and championing the organization, right? Your role as a legislative and corporate governance body is things like policy setting, big picture, forward-looking, right? It does happen sometimes, but you want to avoid the risk of your agendas and your work plan and your effort being dominated by responding to day-to-day things that pop up on your agenda, right? Now, there's room to decide how you want to allocate things, but only the legislative body can focus on the legislative and long-term priorities. If you find there are things popping up on your agenda and you're saying to yourself, well, gee, is this really something that we want to do or have to do? Then you want to think about council, is that something that by ordinance we delegate to our administrative staff, right? In terms of examples of things where you would want to focus your energy, things like, what's the most important documents to a governing body? Right? Things like general ordinances, the annual budget, decisions around corporate assets, decisions around contracts for intergovernmental relationships with other entities. Appointment and oversight of your direct reports. You do have a couple of direct reports. We'll talk about that in a minute. And deciding quasi-judicial and corporate matters reserved to the council, right? But there are certain things where you, by that allocation, giving that away to your manager. Another good example of that is you have purchasing policies, right? Yeah, and they set a level of authority for the manager. And below that level, you've already decided as the legislative policymaker that's not where we want to spend our energy. So if it's in the budget and we appropriated the funds and he needs to buy something or staff needs to buy something that's all been in that budget and they have authority, then they do it. And we don't pull it up as a council issue, right? Conversely, the staff knows that even if it's simply a hot potato, right, but it's their authority and responsibility to carry out that administrative task, then they have to deal with the hot potato, right? And we have to respect the fact that they did. You know, sometimes a business license might get issued for a business that fully complies with the codes, right? And as a matter of course, the municipal code requires that the clerk issue that person a building permit. But somehow we hear about it, and we don't really like those businesses. Now, I used to have a city council member when they were developing their Main Street corridor. It was brand new development. It was first being developed. There were a lot of banks coming in. And the council member didn't like that because they weren't producing sales tax revenue, right? But they fully complied. And his thought was, we don't need any more banks. I said, wait a second, you don't need to pull that issue up because even if you did, that's a zoning question that you would look at legislatively. You wouldn't be going to the clerk talking about who you're handing out business licenses to, right? So that's an important piece of it. Getting out of the weeds there, the governing body should have the longest time horizon, keep the broadest interest of the organization in mind, and be selfish about that. Make sure you find the time to focus your efforts and energy on those big things and work together in your fiduciary role to protect the city. A couple of more tips around role discipline and scope. Recognize that you as elected officials or as appointed officials, you do most of your work and you exercise your responsibilities mainly by voting in a public meeting on items that come in front of you. There's a lot of risk protection around that, right? When it's clear you're acting together as a group. In fact, we're going to get to it in a minute, but under the Open Meetings Law, you can only act as a group in a public meeting setting. We attorneys like that because there are all sorts of additional privileges that apply when the governing body or the appointed body is meeting together as a group at a duly called open meeting. There's things like legislative privilege, quasi-judicial privilege. So even if a debate gets a little heated and we make a little bit of an errant comment, it's not like we're facing civil liability just because of a little bit sharp of a comment. A person can't, during your deliberation you made a comment and I thought you defamed me. Well, if it wasn't intentional malicious defamation, it was just a sharp comment during the legislative debate, you're going to have legislative immunity from those types of situations, okay? So recognize, resist that temptation. Though we have a 7-member body, the analogy does not hold. Sometimes it creeps up on people. They think, well, we got a 7-member body. That means I must hold 1/7 of the power, and darn it, I'm going to go out and use it. That analogy just doesn't hold, right? Respect and embrace the delegations of authority already made by your ordinances, by state law, by your charter. Those actually are there to serve and protect you. They serve you in terms of freeing up your time and turning administrative responsibilities over to staff, right? Whether it's the building code and the building official or the election stuff and the clerk under the state elections law. And they protect you in this sense. If someone brings a lawsuit challenging, for example, the denial of a business license, in my world, the proper defendants are the city and the clerk in the clerk's official capacity. And that ought to be it. But if I have a plaintiff who thinks they have some factual premise or allegations that suggest other people were in the mix on that issue, then they may try to get a little aggressive and add other people as defendants. So if we're all walking the walk and that's not happening, it's easier for us to hold up the org chart and the ordinances and say, you need to dismiss these individuals from this suit because they had no authority and in fact they had no role. And that's a great place to be. So embrace that structure, use it to your advantage. Use your manager as a resource. From the citizen's perspective, do you agree with this notion? And it's not their responsibility to understand organizational structure. It's our responsibility to educate and honor. Sometimes citizens look to you, rightfully so. I got a problem and I need to call my elected official. but you may get all manner of inquiry, a lot of which may not be in your wheelhouse. Right? I hope it's not this bad, but you ever get the email from the citizen that says, I got a ticket in the municipal court, and what are you going to do about it? Well, that's why we have a municipal court. Right? But sometimes they're a little fuzzier. You know, a citizen makes an inquiry to you. It tells you, hey, I'm upset about this road improvement project. Right? Use your staff as a resource to help you. You know, you can unburden yourself, send that over to the manager and say, you know, manager, would you please look into this and provide the individual an update? You know, your manager can talk to that citizen, make sure the citizen gets the information they were looking for. Manager circles back to you and tells you, hey, we took care of that. Next time, and as the ambassador, the champion of the organization, you can reach out to that person. Next time you see him, hey, did we as an organization get you what you needed? And hopefully it's, you know, universal thumbs up, but even if not, then, hey, thank you, we appreciate the feedback, okay? So those work to serve and protect you. One other dynamic, which is a risk internally, doesn't relate much to third-party liability claims, but I wanted to get on your radar because I am doing a presentation on best practices for governance. Mayor, do you have a portion during the agenda where council members get to give reports, council member reports? Yeah, usually near the end of the meeting or something. Yeah, so it's a wise governing body or appointed body that keeps this dynamic in mind. You know, maybe somebody says, Mayor, yes, I've got something to report. Since our last meeting, I did this. And everyone's kind of, you did what? Surprised by that, right? It's a wise council. If this all relates to, you know, things that we're purporting to do on behalf of the council and the city, it's a wise council that talks about what are our norms, right? What are our norms of conduct and expectations for each other with respect to how we represent the council and the organization with things that we do individually in between meetings. Because those things like liaison roles, those are in service of the council as an institution in the city. So I mention it because I want people to be protected. I think it's fair that you're already part-time citizen volunteer legislators. If we raise our hand yet again to do something individually, you know, to go, maybe the mayor's not available to go to the intergovernmental regional task force meeting, and you raise your hand to do that, what's the message that we're conveying as council? Maybe you get surprised when you get to that meeting and the people at that county task force meeting are saying, hey, you know, we thought it was just going to be an update, but we have an urgent matter and we need to know right now at this meeting, what is the position of the Cortez City Council? You have every right to protect yourself and say, well, you know, we haven't talked about that in service to your fiduciary responsibility. If it feels like individually we'd be getting ahead of the council, then we have, you know, we could stiff arm back on that and say our council needs to talk about that so we don't have a surprise internally among ourselves, okay? Lastly, role discipline is important with regard to employee relations and administrative matters. I think my prior examples hit on the administrative side of it. With respect to employees, we all know that the elected governing body, right, only has a few direct reports. And those, is that correct, right? And those are the manager, the attorney, the judge. Anyone else? That means by your charter, ordinances, organizational structure, and/or personnel rules, you have delegated all responsibility for supervision of line employees to the manager and supervisors below the manager. I will tell you from a risk management perspective, what a wonderful place to be from where you sit, because employment practices, liability risks are everywhere. They're like the air we breathe, right? And everything a supervisor does will be scrutinized, second-guessed, dissected after the fact. So yes, you do as council have a couple direct reports, but that's the place and the only place where you want to focus your energy and effort is in terms of having that relationship with your direct reports. You don't want to get individually or improperly involved in some personnel issue involving, you know, staff members below the level of the manager. And you also don't want to do things that might be perceived by them to be orders, right? We're a small collegial group and we're friendly and we can say hi to staff members, but imagine from their perspective how it might seem if you were out about town and you stopped, you know, at a work site and you said to some crew, the city crew that was working, hey, you know, what are you up to? And I'd like to see this. Coming from an elected official? I hope they're not terrified, but they may be wondering, wait a second, you know, my boss told me to do this, and now I've got this communication with the elected or appointed official, and I'm kind of wondering what I should do with that, right? So I think it's on the higher leadership of the organization to be attuned to how they may create perceptions, right, that are inappropriate in those situations. So on the other hand, if you did, you were out and about and you saw something that concerned you, who's your resource? Your manager. Your manager. Yep. And use that effectively and to your advantage. So again, I'm not naive in these issues. I was a city and town attorney for about 25 years, and I know that risk can come from inside or outside. Maybe a citizen had some administrative issue that they had to deal with staff, and they weren't happy with the outcome, so they call you. What are we going to do in that situation? Yeah, you don't want to enable an end run, right? You want to refer that to the city manager, right? Yeah, you have the city manager to explain to you the background and why the decision was made the way it was, so you're armed with that background information, but we should all be working together. If you have an administrative process or rule, even if it leads to an outcome that we can't give people, right, and we have to say no, yeah, we can always explain to them, but as an organization, we all need to support, right, where all those roads lead to in terms of championing the structure of the organization, okay? The other thing that happens if you allow an end run, it can weaken the power of your supervisors, and it can affect morale. And again, not being naive, I know it can come from the inside as well, right? Hey, psst, can I talk to you about my boss? All right? Do we have a ready response? I think the response from a risk management perspective ought to be something like, well, we love our employees at the City of Cortez, but I as a council member or appointed official and we as a body don't get involved in issues at that level. I'd encourage you to talk to your supervisor, HR, the manager or staff or someone else. And if you hear that, even before you can get those words out, you hear something that concerns you, then you want to unburden yourself of that to the manager. And you do want to allow him to give you that response. It's kind of like the attorney's response when they say it depends, right? But the manager's response, if you unburden a personnel, something you've heard about in that area, in that sphere, he's going to say, I got it, and trust in that process, right? In terms of liability risk, the rules do say that he's got it, and it protects you from risk in that regard, okay? Now, going the other direction, you do as a council want to commit, right, to have hopefully good, mutually agreed upon processes for giving direction, for evaluating the performance of, for giving feedback to your direct reports. Make sure you set aside time to have those conversations and commit to healthy practices around that. And you do want to commit to speak with one voice to your direct reports. Now that, I don't mean the voice has to be a 7-0 vote. Your manager might be more comforted if it's a universal thumbs up or head nod, right? But even if it's a split vote and there's differences of opinion, you got to work through it as council. Because managers will tell you this, and they're right, that the are accountable to the voice of the council as a whole, right? It's one boss with 7 members, not 7 bosses. It can get messy sometimes, right? What if you have a nice discussion and the mayor says, great discussion, council, now's time to give some direction to our city manager. And we go down the dais and we got 7 different ideas of what the direction ought to be. That's not the point in time where you want to turn to your manager and say, manager, have you got your direction? Right? But who owns that issue? The council. And you want to. You're the boss in that regard, but you have to commit to bring it back. Presiding officers, mayors among the dark arts that they practice and the wisdom they have, they may see in that issue, it's intractable this evening. We're not going to get clear direction to the manager tonight, but we're going to bring it back at a work session or the next meeting, whatever it is, so that we as a council can work through our own differences and give clear direction to our manager. You want to commit to doing that, because what happens is it can break down otherwise. And when I was a city and town attorney, I saw it many times where you'd have that messy discussion, and then maybe, what happens is later on in the week, people drop by the manager or the administrator's office. You say, hey, that was a messy discussion the other night, but here's what I'd like you to do. Is that consistent with we? Would you be surprised if someone who had an 180-degree difference of opinion on what the direction ought to be when we're doing that, right? So you just have to, and no matter how difficult the issue, you'll get there, right? You just have to work through that. And then once the direction is given, we have to individually agree that, hey, the council has spoken, it's time to move on to the next thing. Yeah, okay. Lastly, I just want to point out, to segue into the concept that whether you're elected or appointed official, I think in public service, sometimes the job does require personal commitments with respect to personal conduct that helps strengthen the council or the body as an institution, right? And the way I look at it is this. I kind of analogize municipal organizations and municipal service to being on a train. We're all on that train. We want that train to get where it's going, our community, and get to its destination, whatever that may be. And while we're on the train during our tenure or our term, we're there in the engine room, making that train stronger, helping it get to where it goes, right? But we're all going to win some or lose some. And in terms of personal conduct, I get this asked that we make some personal sacrifices, such as, setting aside a personal agenda or interest when there's lack of support, right? Even if you ran for office thinking, my number one priority and all the people that supported me and that I take counsel from, my number one priority is that this council adopt an ordinance restricting short-term rentals. Well, if I can't find 3 or more members to come along with me, I have to be willing to shelve that personal interest, right, in view of the work plan and the service of the work plan of the council as determined by the council. So, Mayor, do you ever have split votes? Not that often. Once in a while. Yeah. Well, if you're ever on the side of one of those 4-3 votes, can you go back to your people and kind of tell them, I didn't vote for that one? Sure you can. Look, I'm just the insurance guy. Far be it from me to, you can tell your folks anything you want, right? But they know how you voted from the public record anyway. But in terms of that personal sacrifice, in terms of making the engine stronger, right? Would it be a different message if you said, I didn't vote for that one, but you know what? We had a real healthy discussion around that issue. There were a lot of different points of view. I fought like heck from my point of view. But you know what? Council decided to go a different direction, and I support the decision of the council, right? It does have a liability dynamic. I'll give you an example. You don't have to be the number one cheerleader of a decision you didn't support or didn't agree with, but you can't affirmatively attempt to undermine it. I once had a development application that was a 4-3 vote, split vote, and council it was like a planned development, and the council has to approve the final site plan. Council got over the hump on whether or not to approve this by adding a condition of approval that said, okay, we're okay with this, we're going to vote to approve it. As long as there's a condition of approval, you get an easement from the neighbor for an additional access to help alleviate the traffic problem. And the neighbor was even at the public hearing, said, yes, I'll negotiate in good faith with the owner, the applicant, for that easement. Well, some people still didn't like that. It was a 4-3 vote, but it was approved. One of the people on the 3 side, what did they do a couple of days later? They went and visited the neighbor, trying to convince the neighbor to do what? Not grant the easement. Good idea from a standpoint? Yeah. It didn't get very far in the claims context because with the city attorney's sage advice, the individual understood that they should probably just stop trying to do that. But the risk is a thing like a tort, like interference. Was it tortious interference with someone's potential business advantage? Again, the hat is always on in that regard, okay? A couple more here just to mention, tying it back to the last one. Sometimes people call it CIRSA and say, isn't there a statute that controls this? But there's not. The more and more I get calls about, because do you agree with the notion it's like everybody wants to know today's news, yesterday? We're so information driven and people crave information. And they're gonna come to you craving information about what's going on in the city. And it's a wise council that avoids that dynamic where we might have one or more of our members that are getting ahead of or speaking for council before council has had a chance to speak. I usually hear that concern from other members who say, I feel like I'm coming to the deliberation now with 1 foot in a bucket because there's already this point of view out there that everyone's perceiving to be the council's point of view, but actually we haven't even had a board discussion about it. So I think in terms of personal conduct, that's an interesting dynamic. Okay. Let's pivot to transparency issues. I just want to cover a couple of things real quickly. I'm sure the Attorney's Office and staff has given you some information on this, but just remember in terms of the openness rule, right? The Colorado Open Meetings Act applies to the council and to all local public bodies. A lot going on there, but the basic rule is this. Whenever 3 or more members of the council meet to discuss public business, that's a discussion that has to be open to the public, okay? And then any action by the council can only occur in a public meeting where there's proper notice and an agenda. The state statute says that a meeting for purposes of this rule includes any kind of gathering, whether it's by phone, in person, or by electronic means. So what do you think about email? Right, that's why staff says do not use email as a substitute for your board discussions, because you can end up inadvertently walking into an open meetings problem if 3 or more members are using email to discuss the merits or substance of a matter that's pending in front of the council, okay? Interestingly, they added the phrase electronically back in 1996. And what were they thinking of then? That's back when we all had Netscape, you know, and the computer made the funny noise when you dial. But the phrase lives on, and there are other electronic means of communication. So what do you think about texting? Can the openness requirement be triggered by texting? Yeah, in my view, sure. You know, I always used to run to the legal answer and go, oh, we don't have a reported appellate case out of the Colorado Supreme Court that says so. But yes, intuitively, it's a form of electronic communication. So if 3 or more members are discussing public business by text, that would also run the risk of an open meetings violation. So the whole takeaway from all of that is save for your agendized open public meetings discussion of the merits or substance of the issues that you have in front of the council, okay? Now, it's a rule of 3. It applies whenever 3 or more meet. So that must mean 2 or less, or talking to yourself is okay. I hope this job doesn't force you to do that, right? But one-on-one discussion's okay, right? It's a rule of 3. 3, the openness applies. So what do we think about one-on-one. Yeah, there's a lot of names for that. They call it a serial meeting or a daisy chain meeting. In Texas, they call it a walking quorum, which I love working into my presentation because it sounds so Texas. Walking around getting a quorum. So here's the bottom line on that, just in the interest of time. In a legal proceeding, from my view, if the evidence comes in and it suggests that what occurred in the open public meeting was a mere rubber stamping of a decision that had been reached by means outside of the meeting, whether it was by texting or walking around one-on-one, then that's where the open meetings law violation lies, okay? So you want to be cognizant of that. Make sure you don't backdoor into serial meetings. It does require that we self-regulate. You know, we have to be willing to say to each other, look, you know, who else have you talked to? Okay, well, wait a second. Let's just cue this up. Let's get it on the agenda. We'll have our discussion at the board meeting about that issue, because that's where you do your best work anyway. You're all here and can see and communicate contemporaneously and share your views and so on and so forth, right? Now, none of that is to gainsay the fact that, yes, part of the job is one-on-one relationships. And it's okay to sit down and have a coffee with a fellow council member, not on a quasi-judicial matter, but if you just, you know, hey, what are your general attitudes about this or that? That's okay, but we don't want to do it one-on-one, okay? Executive sessions, just want to point out that you are allowed to have executive sessions, but only for a narrow set of topics. It may seem like it takes a lot of time, but when you're queuing up executive sessions, make sure you cross all the T's and dot all the I's when you're making a motion to go into executive session. Very important, because I will tell you from a risk standpoint, there are claimants around the state, attorneys or claimants around the state who have no connection to your community, might have no interest in the business you're conducting, but they have a legal right to challenge your compliance with the open meetings law. And in our commitment to transparency, people can watch your meetings if you video stream them. They can read your minutes. They can look at your agenda. And trust me, if they believe there was a technical violation of the open meetings requirements, they're none too happy to send you a letter that says, I think you violated the open meetings law. And even if it's debatable, or even if it's kind of like, okay, I'll give you that point, all right, mea culpa, we'll do better next time. They may still send you, and they say, okay, great, I'm glad you do better next time, but you owe me some money now for ferreting out your noncompliance, right? And so make sure you have staff available, rely upon their advice, and make sure we do that all appropriately. Once you're in executive session, just a bit for you, the participants, it's your obligation to self-police and make sure we stay on topic. It's also your obligation as fiduciaries to protect confidential information of the town. That can get a little confusing sometimes, particularly when you're in an executive session for a matter subject to negotiation. Sometimes you've got to hear background. Like maybe you're thinking about buying a piece of property and you want to ask staff, remind me, I know this property is available and we might, but what are our priorities? You know, as we develop our strategy for purchasing, we need a little background, right? So a good tactic in this regard is before you break from executive session, maybe it's the presiding officer says to the group, of all the confidential information that we've discussed in executive session, which information, if any, leaves this room and who's our spokesperson? And that as fiduciaries, we're obligated to honor that agreement to confidentiality. That's true even if you voted against going into executive session, and even if you can't stand the idea of the underlying transaction that was discussed. You're duty bound to protect that information and not disseminate that or discuss it with others unless and until the council as a group gets back together and decides to treat that confidential information differently. Okay, in terms of just a couple thoughts on meeting best practices. Actually, I'll start with this.
I just have a question about executive sessions.
Yes.
Because sometimes we have to call them last minute,
Yeah.
like up and then we add it to the agenda, but we didn't notice that. I guess is that okay?
I think it is allowed. If you know it's gonna, if you know in advance before the agenda is prepared that you're gonna have an executive session, the better practice would be to add it then. But if it comes up and you want to add it that evening, you can. But my advice would be make sure you slow down to almost a crawl and make sure that you not only can all the legal compliance, but do what else you can above and beyond that to explain why you're having the executive session, because your citizens will appreciate that extra commitment to transparency, right? And if it's lawful, Patrick's got to answer the question whether it's lawfully authorized and whether it's proceed, right? You'll do all that. But that extra commitment to transparency, will help explain to people this is why the best interest of the organization is served by doing this. But if you know you're going to have it added in advance. But if you can't, I think it's allowed. The bigger concept, of course, is use executive session sparingly. I've heard the notion that even if we're absolutely correct with regard to all the legal procedures and so on and so forth, perceived overuse of executive session sometimes creates a risk above my pay grade, right? The political risk of people saying, why so many executive sessions? So always the first question is, do we really need an executive session or can we handle this publicly? And then if we really do need it, make sure you get staff advice and follow all the appropriate procedures. Okay, that helpful? Yeah. Yes.
My question has to do on the open meetings law.
Yes.
Is it acceptable to send out an email, for example, to all the council members to say, I just want you to know about this and be done with it? And just to inform people, because I think we fall back, some people get informed about something, others don't. And as long as there's no discussion that's happening about it, it's just that I want to inform you and I'm done with it. Is that acceptable?
Yeah, in general, yes. It might depend. We might have a situation more guarded response or a concern, right? I didn't mention this, but I thank you for the question because it reminded me that I put at your places a little handout about email. And one of the things the state legislature did a couple of years ago was help identify expressly what some of the safe harbors are around the use of email. And one of them is if a council member is simply sending to the other members of council, even if all 7 of you are on that email thread, if it's just an FYI and there's no discussion, then that's okay. But a couple of best practices in that regard: copy your manager so that he knows, right? And then also resist the temptation to send an FYI that really is your lobbying effort, right? Because that's not truly FYI. That sounds more deliberative to me, right? And then be cognizant of this risk as well. Somebody sends an FYI, if it borders on the deliberative and it's talking about FYI for something that's on our agenda for next week, what if someone then responds back? And then someone else responds back? And then someone else responds back? And we're all saying, this is FYI only, but we're actually deliberating with each other under the guise of FYIs. Not a good place to be. Yep. But FYIs are okay. Merely posing a question for later discussion at a meeting is also a safe harbor. Emails about mere scheduling and availability is okay, even if all 7 of you are on that thread. And then copying your fellow council members, but also council your manager, so that everyone, we don't have communication breakdown. If you have to respond to a constituent, like the mayor probably gets more of these than most, but if you she gets an email from a citizen, isn't sure whether you all got individually the same email, so she writes back to that citizen, copies the manager, and copies all you, so that you all know that a citizen made this inquiry to the mayor and the mayor responded. That's also not a discussion among you all, so that's another safe harbor under the statute. Patrick?
Yeah, one of the ways we deal with that, and I think Drew follows my procedure some, if I'm going to send an attorney-client privileged opinion or advise you of something, I will send it to the entire council, but I'll specifically state in the email, please do not reply all, contact me individually if you have questions or comments, and I specifically say to avoid conflicts with the open meetings law. And it's always a good reminder, because sometimes you're tempted to just say, well, I don't think that's right, and I read the statute differently than you did. And I think having those discussions and debates and incorporating all your other council members in the discussion is violation. So, you call me on the phone or do a new email directly to me, and don't copy your other council members is, I think, the better practice. So, and Drew, if you have a
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, Councilmember Randall, good question, but sometimes, we just want to avoid even the appearance of evil, as it were. And so in that case, if you have something that's an FYI for the entire council, what normally happens now is that'll get sent to me, and then I will forward that on to the council members, and I'll put it in a form that I'm kind of the filter, or the funnel in, and then the funnel back out, and then vice versa.
Yeah, and I would
Keeps
say
that
that's best
separation.
practice. Right, it allows on the front end, right, you to avoid the potential open meetings risk going out, and then it gives you a resource, your manager, going the other way, right? And so if you individually, it goes out, you have a concern, you can express that to the manager. He can divine whether, based on any feedback he's got, whether there's anything left that might need council attention, and then he can follow up as needed, right? Sometimes it may not be an inquiry that you have, but the manager sends out something, just a heads up so that you know. Right? You always want to hear it first from your manager, but you then have a question, and if he hears that from enough of you, you may say, okay, well, we'll put this on my report during the next meeting, or if it's worthy of an agenda, a work session, or what have you. So that's, the best practice resource is to use that to enable that to happen without risk of open meetings violation. Okay. Just a couple of things on open meetings stuff. Actually, I'll start with this. How are meetings going? Good. Public comment periods okay and all that? Yeah, good. For the new folks in particular, just recognize, that good meetings start with preparation for the meetings. Recognize that packet in the agenda, that's what's framing the work that you're going to do that evening. You don't have to feel like you have that responsibility to eat the entire elephant in one sitting, right? Sometimes people mention things during public comment, and there's this temptation to start getting into a substantive discussion of it, right? You want to resist that temptation because the item's not on your agenda, right? And definitely want to avoid adding agenda items the night of. I call it the empty chair principle, right? If there's a chair in the audience that would have been filled, had someone known you were going to deliberate about this or that issue this evening, then you want to hold it over to another meeting. Sometimes it's a little more nuanced. Maybe sometimes during those board reports that you talk about, sometimes it gets momentum. Right? I just had one of these where I was counsel, and the person who was making a report was just a liaison to the regional airport noise task force. And he just reported, hey, I went to the last airport noise task force, and it wasn't a good meeting, I don't feel like we're making, and then someone said, well, you know what we ought to do? We ought to leave the task force. And all of a sudden there's a debate about whether or not this entity, this council wanted to leave the task force. And then snowballed, and somebody said, I make a motion. I make a motion that we drop our, we leave the task force. So finally, another councilman said, wait a second, it's not on our agenda. And this is a hot topic for our community, so let's make sure we do it the right way and queue it up. Sometimes we have informality, and we, pride ourselves in some more informality, but we don't want it to be a fault or create risks, okay? And then whatever your house rules are for sequencing and discussion, make sure you honor those, whether it's public comment or how you approach discussions or how you approach your own deliberations. Do you all use Robert's Rules of Order?
Or Bob's.
Or Bob's, yeah. You want to use those rules of procedure to help facilitate getting stuff done, not debilitating. And frankly, yes, if rules are there to protect the minority. So if someone raises a concern and says, I want to do it by the book, then we're going to do it by the book. But on the other hand, if we're of universal consensus, we got a little hiccup, like how do we do this? And we go, well, if there's consensus and we all agree, then we can just move forward, right? If it does raise a legal concern, someone will throw the red flag from the sidelines and go, wait a second, we need to do this or that. All right, ethics, I just want to put this slide up and point out that there's a handout at your places on ethics. Again, as elected or appointed officials, you're all subject to Colorado state standards of conduct. Ethics rules sometimes can feel like they're in a faraway place and written in legalese, but find yourself a good resource. The Colorado Municipal League has a pamphlet describing what the Code of Ethics requires. Staff can probably provide you with other information. Whatever that resource looks like, take the time to, read through those rules a couple of times so you get a good working familiarity with what the rules are. And that's a great place to be, because then you're ready to spot and deal with the legal issues before they become actual problems. You want to decide the appropriate course of conduct before the bell rings, because if the bell rings, it's hard to unring the bell, okay? Now, the three main ones on the slide are talked about further in the handout, but you all know in general terms what a conflict of interest is, right? Just make sure that if the body or the council is going to take some action that directly and substantially affects your own personal financial interest, you have to make a disclosure, recuse yourself from the discussion and vote, right? Not attempt to influence the other decision makers, and do you leave the room when you step aside? Okay.
Yeah.
Confidential information, don't use or disclose confidential information for personal benefit. Good way to protect yourself in that is if you're ever uncertain, just ask. That's never a silly question to ask staff. Is this, this piece of information, is it confidential or is it in the public domain? And then gifts. We actually have a constitutional amendment in Colorado around gifts. I know you all kind of get a very small stipend, right, for being on the council. Yeah, so I'm here to tell you it's not the lavish salary or the lavish gifts, right, that bring us to public service. But more seriously, the constitutional amendment basically says this: don't accept any gift from any one person in any 1 year of more than $75 if it's in any way connected to your status as a public official. Subject to this big caveat, don't accept the gift no matter what it's worth if it's obvious to a reasonable person, that's an objective standard, that the gift is being offered to influence your vote, reward you for some official action that you've taken, or to get you to stray from the fair and impartial discharge of your duties. So it's all about timing and context. If it doesn't feel right, decline the gift. And then lastly, recognize in matters of ethics, it's kind of, whether we think it's fair or unfair, do you agree with the notion that sometimes in matters of ethics, perception equals reality and reality equals perception, right? So sometimes, even when we've analyzed the situation, we've determined we don't have a conflict, but there's still this kind of air in the room of concern or suspicion, right? A comment on the record at that time might be helpful. Ethics is a lot about letting people know where you're coming from, disclosing the interest that you have or relationship you have, even if they may not rise to the level of a legally impermissible conflict that requires you to recuse, okay? So whatever that looks like to you all, find those rules, and I hope the handouts helpful. I take full responsibility for my handout. The state ethics code is about 20-some pages long, so this was my attempt to just put some of the general principles on one sheet of paper for you. All right. Finally, I want to talk about due process. And particularly for the new folks, you're going to find that one of the most fascinating things, and the veterans know this, fascinating thing about being a local government official is you get to wear different hats, right? Most of the time on the city council, you're in the legislative mode, the governing body mode, making policy, dealing with ordinances, policies, contracts. But for certain matters, right, you're deciding property rights matters, right? And at the local government level here in Colorado, those are decisions like licensing. You all are the liquor licensing authority. You have marijuana licenses. You're all the marijuana licensing authority. And land use matters, where you as a council get to make decisions and you as a planning commission get to make recommendations involving the use of individuals' protected property rights. That's a pretty awesome power, right? You got a 7-member planning commission? Yeah, 5? 5. So I'm not sure, at the end of the day, we got 12 people in the city that have the power to decide, for example, whether or not somebody can rezone their property or subdivide their property or have a conditional use permit. That's a pretty awesome power, right? The grand bargain in exchange for having that power at the local government level, and you want that power, right? We don't want the state or the county deciding land use matters, but the grand bargain is you must commit to honoring the due process rights of all the interested parties involved in that process. And it requires that you conduct yourself individually and as a body differently with respect to these quasi-judicial matters, okay? You have an obligation to essentially act like judges and conduct yourself like judges, okay? And do the things that judges would do and don't do the things that judges wouldn't do. A quasi-judicial proceeding is essentially this. It's a decision where we provide additional notice to the interested parties that explains the added publication in the newspaper and the sign on the property, or if it's a liquor license, that big sign in the front window. We're honoring the due process requirement when we do that. So we provide more notice, and then we have an evidentiary hearing in front of the council or the commission, right? Where the decision is based on pre-existing legal standards, not personal preferences or viewpoints, not popular demand, based on pre-existing legal standards, and the decision is made by a fair and impartial judge, which is all of you. So it all sounds a little weird, right? You're thinking, oh, wait a second, that's not what I thought when I ran for office. I thought I was a legislator. I thought it was kind of freewheeling policymaking. Well, for this role, in exercising this power, it's completely different. It sounds kind of wonky, but we know where it comes from, right? We all know intuitively where it comes from. Constitution says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and that's where it all comes from, okay? So we do a separate training on quasi-judicial process and best practices. We're happy to come visit again and do that training. It's about an hour or so, or we can do it virtually, but here's a couple of tips. It's kind of the most important tips from my perspective on best practices around quasi-judicial proceedings. First, limit your involvement on that matter to just the public hearing. I know, and I sympathize with the idea that this sounds like a lonely part of the job, because it is. Because what happens in a community when there's a controversial licensing application or a controversial land use application coming up? What's the citizen's view? Well, I need to talk to my planning commissioner or my council member and make sure they understand why they ought to vote yes or no. But as the judges, we need to stay away from that. So irrespective of how much buzz there is going on, we want to say as the judges, I have to stay detached. So staff can help arm you with ways to approach these situations, but if a citizen approaches you at the supermarket and says, you know, I'd like to talk to you if you have a moment about why you need to approve or deny that rezoning request, you need to be prepared and armed, you know, to tell them, look, it's not that I don't want to hear from you. I'd love to hear from you, but I can only engage with you at the public hearing. You know, please come to the public hearing. If you can't, you can send in comments to staff. Usually folks get it when you explain it this way. Dear citizen, if it were your land use application or your licensing request, would it seem fair to you if we as the decision makers, right, we're talking about your application and the reasons why we might vote for or against it outside of your earshot, where you don't have a chance to respond. That's the whole touchstone of the due process clause. Almost all infirmaries around the due process problem are cured when we make sure that everything just happens in the public hearing. Okay? All right. Remain neutral. Make sure you don't make up your mind before the hearing. Usually not this obvious, but once in a while, you're the licensing authority for marijuana. You know, a lot of communities, I don't know how that ended up, whether you did that as a policy matter by ordinance or by initiative or referendum or what have you, but now you're the licensing authority. So you're the judges of these applications. In some communities, I would have a member of the governing body who would say to the newspaper reporter, well, I'm never going to vote in favor of a marijuana dispensary because I didn't want him here in the first place. Does that sound like a rules-based decision maker, right? Who's going to follow the criteria and remain fair and impartial, right? So we can't make prejudicial pre-hearing statements. Make sure we don't engage with each other or interested parties outside of the hearing. That's called an ex parte communication. When we at CIRSA advise you against staying away from that, what I want to do is I want you to stay in the game. Since we have only 12 people that have that power, right, we want you to stay in the game, remain fair and neutral, stay away from it until it's at your hearing so that at the hearing there's not an objection at the outset that says, I'd like to recuse this member because I think they've engaged in prejudicial ex parte communications. Okay, so that's an important piece of it. Lastly, deliberations matter. Very important. That's kind of the magic part of the hearing, where the mayor is, called a hearing to order, the applicant's presented, the staff presented, the public presented. We bring it back to council and say, all right, let's talk about how we want to decide this application. We at CIRSA always want you to have a deliberation as the decision makers. What's our recommendation or what's our decision? But it's the point in time where you want to get, that part of the staff report that lists the decision-making criteria and focus your deliberations on those standards. Right? I'll give you some examples. Let's say you got a proposed conditional use. Some of these standards can sometimes sound a little fuzzy or opaque, right? But we're always going to have a good deliberation and make a good record when we use what I call Sam's rule of why. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you got a proposed conditional use on the agenda, and we had the hearing, mayor brings it back, and let's deliberate. I say, Mayor, I'll start. I'm going to vote no because I don't like it. That's a bit rocky, right? Well, why don't you like it? Well, I don't like it because the business owner, didn't contribute to the Christmas toy drive last year. Not a relevant pre-existing legal standard. I'm going to vote against this conditional use because I just don't like banks if they were a conditional use. This is the part of the job that requires you to put your personal preferences aside. Or I'm going to vote no because everybody in the audience testified that I ought to vote no. That's not how quasi-judicial decision-making works either, right? So we're going to throw away all those irrelevant criteria and we're going to get focused on the standards in your code. So for a conditional use permit, you might say, Mayor, I'm going to vote no, I don't like it. That's rocky, but we just turn to each other and say, why? Why don't you like it? Well, I don't like it because it doesn't meet our criteria. Keep going. Why doesn't it meet our criteria? I don't like it because it's incompatible with the neighborhood. Well, now we're getting somewhere, because one of the standards for approval or denial of a conditional use permit under the Cortez Municipal Code is compatibility with adjacent existing uses. But keep going. Why isn't it compatible with the adjacent existing uses? Because according to the staff report, right, and the additional testimony that was presented at the hearing, the existing uses surrounding this proposed conditional use are all built to one-story bungalow style using certain types of architecture, whereas this request by the applicant is for a four-story southern colonial plantation type thing with columns. It's just not compatible. Well, we're making a record of good reasons, right? So just keep working through the exercise. That puts you in a great place. As I mentioned during my opening comments, they're very important from a risk standpoint, because if we do the rule of why, then you naturally get to defensible, fact-based reasons for your decision. And what it's done for us magically at CIRSA is given us a transcript to defend your decision, okay? There's a couple of presentations on the bottom of the slide there. If you want to look at those about quasi-judicial proceedings, and I hope those are of help to you. So finally, just want to wrap things up, and then I'll open it up for any questions. I know you're just moving on to your next meeting, but a couple of thoughts to get out of the weeds. Just recognize that as the elected leaders, as the appointed leaders, you help set the tone for the entire organization, right? You hold powerful positions in local government. Use that power wisely and humanely. Do you all agree with this notion? I get mixed results when I hear this. Do we agree with the notion that incivility seems to be a little bit on the rise? I don't know. But just recognize that sometimes the job might require that we practice civility even in the face of incivility, right? But you're up to the task. We can control, not everything, but we can control most of the dynamics, and by our own behaviors, people learn those behaviors, and they know that if the council or the body is practicing professionalism and respect and civility, then that's going to rub off, and you're going to continue to be in a great place. Another risk issue is meetings ought not to have surprises. Your meetings ought not to have like these surprise moments or gotcha moments. They definitely ought not to have staff bashing, right? Even if you had some individual concern, imagine how powerful it is during public comment if a person stands up and just engages, they've got some beef with a staff member and they just launch off on a personal attack. Imagine how powerful it is, right? If we just recalibrate at the end, by saying, remember, please, we ask that people direct their comments to the council only, and that we ask that you be professional and not engage in personal attacks. It may not stop. They may come back to the next meeting with the same thing. They might have even First Amendment rights to say what they want to say. But it shows the organization and folks, even if you had an individual concern, that old idea of criticize privately but support publicly helps strengthen the organization. As a governing body, be willing to have disagreements without being disagreeable, right? Definitely ought not to let disagreements create discord or drive how you interact with each other or set your agenda. Be willing to, even in the face of a split vote, to say the council has spoken and we're moving on to the next item. And then my last bullet there is to suggest, true for everyone, but particularly at the governing body level, right? Part of the job is touting your organization's successes. Who agrees with the notion that sometimes what you see or hear about local government kind of focuses on the negative stuff? Social media doesn't do that, does it? Sometimes it does, right? So part of the scope of employment is, remind folks of the great things that council's doing, that your staff's doing, that the city's doing. It does help calibrate attitudes. From a insurance attorney, I think it helps calibrate attitudes. It might even influence jury pools, stuff like that. But it's more closer to home. It reminds people that government's getting good things done for them and builds faith and trust in government. So finally with that, to wrap things up, commit to the stewardship, ambassador responsibilities, commit to the fiduciary responsibilities that you share as an elected appointed leader, and that will serve you well. So with that, I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that there's a quasi-judicial handout that's part of the packet of materials that I put your places, and there's also a copy of our ethics liability handbook. I know my comments were focused kind of on some pretty serious liability topics, but if you're looking for a lighthearted take on some of those things, tucked inside the book is a little QR code that takes you to a couple of 3 or 4 minute videos that we recorded at CIRSA. I didn't think I'd be conscripted into being an actor, but I was. So we actually got a comedian to help us. So it's a little bit of a lighthearted take, because we got to find humor in this where we can sometimes, and a lighthearted take on some of the serious issues that you have to deal with. And then finally, my last slide is with some additional resources. So Mayor and Council and others, thank you for inviting me down to visit with you all. Always great to see you all. I'll open up for any questions that you have. If there aren't any, thanks so much.
I have a question. It's a little far afield of what you, but as CIRSA, I just wanted to know what CIRSA's, particularly from a liability standpoint, what CIRSA's understanding of the digital accessibility new Colorado law and how that will apply to CIRSA, both from potential liability. And I guess the other thing I was thinking of is if it creates a new liability for a whole lot of municipalities, how it would affect rates as well.
Yeah, so on the first piece of it, the statute on was set to take effect July 1. Still takes effect, but I believe that the legislature, I have to go back and look at the final bill, but I believe the legislature passed and that the governor will likely sign, if he hasn't done so already, a bill that adds an additional year, kind of a hiatus. But it's not really an absolute one-year timeout. What it creates is immunity from liability as long as you are in good faith, taking steps to implement the statute. It does create a new cause of action against local governments, so we need to be attuned to our responsibilities there. I guess what I direct to the governing bodies when I make these comments is it may sound like a lot of money, but in your budget, you want a resource, right? Both for compliance and protection of your own data and systems, you want to resource adequately IT systems. Absolutely. We don't have enough data to know what this is going to look like in terms of loss history and how it might affect rates. I also don't know, getting more into what I deal with, is I don't know if these cases are going to present themselves as purely damages claims, because the statute added a cause of action to the general remedies provision of the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act. So it authorizes the claimant to bring an action for damages or an action for statutory penalties, right? And I'm not sure what we're going to see, whether we're going to see actual damages claim, statutory penalties claim. I think there's a fear that there's going to be a wave of statutory penalties claims. And now, getting to the root of the issue with regard to coverage, we have to look at those claims on an individualized basis and determine whether we're looking at remedies that are in the nature of damages, right? And whether the claim is otherwise a covered claim, in which case we would defend that, or whether it falls outside of coverage. Our coverage does exclude fines and penalties, but this is a little bit of a mixed bag that we're going to have to look at more closely, because what the legislature is doing is enabling private attorneys general, essentially, to bring claims for what are arguably damages. Okay? Sorry, I don't have a bottom line answer, but I hope that helps. A great question. Thanks so much. It's been on our mind a lot. Any other questions for me? All right. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Always informative and just great resources, and we appreciate you making the trip down here.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I have another training down in this way tomorrow, but then unfortunately I have to head